Occupation of key roads in Admiralty, Causeway Bay and Mong Kok continue today, with no end in sight, as LegCo President Zhang Yuxing decided to postpone tomorrow's resumption of council business after the summer break.
Zhang said pro-government lawmakers feared for their personal safety going back to work at Tamar, but their pan-democratic colleagues accused them of making excuses to discredit the protest movement.
Student leaders are still waiting for talks with the Chief Secretary by the end of this week. Day 10 of the mass sit-in for true democracy saw protesters continuing to lay siege to the government's headquarters, the LegCo complex and the chief executive's office at Tamar, although their numbers appeared significantly reduced. Student leaders who helped get the civil disobedience movement started are now waiting for talks on political reform with Chief Secretary Carrie Lam before Sunday. That means the occupation of major roads in Admiralty, Causeway Bay and Mong Kok will continue this week, and even further, as student leaders have agreed with government officials there should be several rounds of talks. Even if they were to strike a deal, the negotiating students do not represent all the protesters out in the streets, as the movement for genuine reform has taken a life of its own. Former LegCo President Rita Fan reminded the public of the futility of the students' original demands for the chief executive's resignation and for Beijing to withdraw its restrictive framework for democratic reform here. She warned protesters that if they continued their blockades, they will lose public sympathy and support. In the midst of the uncertainty, LegCo President Zhang Yuxing dropped a bombshell, cancelling tomorrow's council meeting, the first after the summer recess, and rescheduling it for next Wednesday. His announcement came after 23 pan-democrat lawmakers proposed that the original agenda be replaced with a debate on the police use of tear gas against peaceful protesters in Admiralty and accusations that triad-linked thugs attacked protesters in Mong Kok last week.
Our worry is if the council debates such a controversial issue as the Occupy campaign and the way the police have been dealing with it, the debate inevitably will be very emotional, and it will attract a large number of people, both supporting the Occupy Central movement and strongly against it.
Zhang made the decision after 41 pro-establishment lawmakers wrote to him to express fears about their personal safety when returning to work at Tamar, which is under siege by many who see Beijing loyalists as the enemy.
I'm not accusing anyone taking part in the Occupy campaign or on the other camp of possible violence. However, scenes we have seen in the last week, I think, very clearly show that sometimes the situation can get out of hand without the intention of anybody.
The pan-democrats were quick to jump in, accusing the government and pro-government lawmakers of hijacking LegCo.
They fear public opinion. They do not have the courage and audacity to stand up and defend what the SAR government has done and what the police did to the very peaceful demonstrators outside.
The pan-democrats challenged Zhang's logic and described his explanation as an excuse to help the government buy more time for the street occupation to fizzle out.
You can avoid tomorrow's meeting, but you cannot dodge the issue forever. Even if the meeting is adjourned for a week, 2 weeks, or 3 weeks, we shall still insist on finding the culprit for the scaremongering campaign.
Labour Party lawmaker Sid Ho accused the pro-establishment camp of deliberately hindering the functioning of LegCo so it could blame protesters later on. A prolonged suspension of LegCo business could seriously hamper the functioning of the government and public services, piling more pressure on the government and protest leaders to work out a compromise. That compromise is looking very unlikely because there are polls apart on how much democracy Hong Kong should have.
The police have again warned of a crackdown in Mong Kok, urging protesters to leave the site they've occupied as it's a high-risk area.
They've arrested 39 people involved in violent clashes last week and warned that the situation remains volatile there. ATV's Arthur Erkiola reports.
The situation was mostly peaceful throughout the day in Mongkok, apart from the occasional flare-up of tensions between demonstrators and those losing their patience with the blockade of the junction of Argyle Street and Nathan Road. Protesters have been ignoring calls by leaders of the civil disobedience movement to abandon the area because of the potential for mob violence. Police today had a warning about that, saying the situation is particularly volatile in the busy retail hub. They stressed there is an increasing chance of further confrontations between protesters and anti-Occupy demonstrators after the violence last week, which involved triad gangsters attacking protesters.
Some people are also provoking the others. The location has become a high-risk area. Some people are organizing or asking the protester to stay and occupy the roads. This is a totally reckless act, neglecting the safety of others, in particular youngsters.
There was another warning that the disruption to daily life in an extremely busy part of Hong Kong would not be allowed to continue indefinitely.
Police stress that to prevent violent crimes and reduce harm to life and property, we will take actions at the appropriate time. Again, for the sake of personal safety, I urge all people there, students, onlookers, and others, to leave this high-risk area at once.
Hui denied accusations made on social media that undercover officers were deliberately inciting trouble.
There was an allegation that a plainclothes officers mixed with the crowd and incite other protesters. I'm here to firmly rebut the allegation. This is totally unfounded and defamatory.
The force also called on remaining protesters at the government compound in Tamar to clear out and remove roadblocks, as this was causing problems for those in need of government assistance. Arthur Erkiola, ATV News.
Primary school students returned to class today, a day after secondary schools in Wan Chai Central and Western reopened.
Although many students arrived late, parents and teachers agreed that the resumption of classes went smoother than expected. ATV's Winnie Wong reports.
After missing class last week and yesterday, it was business as usual today for primary school students in Wan Chai, Central and Western, but many arrived late. At this school in Kennedy Town, 26 students missed the opening bell, compared with 4 or 5 normally. School bus drivers said traffic was heavy along roads once blocked by thousands of democracy demonstrators. But school buses running from Causeway Bay to Kennedy Town canceled their services indefinitely because Harcourt Road in Admiralty remained barricaded. I left the house 10 minutes earlier than usual, but realized there were no taxis, said this parent after dropping her child at a school in Western. I ended up having to take the minibus to Causeway Bay, then the MTR, before walking the rest of the way. It was quite hectic. Some students were not quite used to being late for assembly at 7:45 a.m. Others took it in their stride.
No, she woke up the normal time. She was happy to be back at school, and she said, get a move on, Daddy, we've got to be at school. The traffic is okay, but normally we come on the tram from Causeway Bay down near Victoria Park up to here. So today there's no tram, so it's no problem. Her father carries her. She's very happy, and I ran here with her on my shoulder, so we get here on time.
Some 70% of the primary schools in the Wan Chai areas have 30 to 40% of their students coming to school late, and the time ranges between 20 to 30 minutes. And for Central and Western districts, the time of lateness ranges from 5 minutes to 30 minutes, and about 30% of the schools have registered 10 to 25% of their students coming schools late.
Classes for all schools and kindergartens in Wan Chai, Central and Western were closed last Monday, a day after the police fired tear gas at peaceful protesters. The use of tear gas on locals for the first time since 1967 swelled the ranks of the demonstrators in Admiralty as a protest spread to Causeway Bay. The seizure of major streets by protesters caused massive tailbacks, forcing the authorities to suspend classes in the 3 areas. kindergartens remain shut. Winna Wong, ATV News.
The number of pro-democracy protesters camping out in Admiralty, Mongkok and Causeway Bay continued to dwindle on the 10th day of the mass sit-in.
But die-hard demonstrators are digging in for a long haul and adjusting to cooler weather, sleeping in the rough. This was the scene this morning at Connaught Road Central, close to the government's headquarters. And this was the same area last Wednesday when tens of thousands gathered to demand real democracy. Since then, the number of demonstrators has continued to dwindle. The atmosphere was also calm in Mongkok and Causeway Bay, with the police presence in the two major occupied road arteries sharply down from previous days. The sudden drop in temperature and strong winds did not lower the spirits of those who decided to remain and make the cold concrete their beds. This protester said the drop in the mercury hasn't cooled his desire for genuine democracy. People have been sending a lot of supplies to help us brave the cold, so it's no big deal, said this demonstrator. Workers in Admiralty said they didn't have a hard time reaching their offices this morning.
It's okay today. There's several all okay since the 3rd of October. Yeah. Before the end of the September.
It's very convenient. I just buy the MTR, and then every day I take the MTR. It's no problem. It's very traffic is okay.
Civil servants share the same view as they used the path cleared by protesters yesterday to enter the government's headquarters. Michelle Lee, director of the Leisure and Cultural Services Department, says she took the MTR today and hoped everyone had reached their workplace without much inconvenience. Permanent Secretary for Financial Services and the Treasury Au Keng Chi said Hong Kong is a very safe city and this should be cherished by all. Chief Executive Leung Chun-ying's weekly cabinet meeting this morning was held at Government House instead of his office in Tamar, which is still under siege. Leung also abandoned his routine of talking to the media before the session. And there was no zone set up outside Government House for people to petition Leung. There was severe traffic congestion across Hong Kong today as major roads in Kowloon and the island side remain blocked by Occupy protesters.
Apart from tailbacks stretching 5 kilometers or more, rush hour was also extended for hours. Here's Winna Wong.
Commuters left home earlier than usual this morning to get to work or school, but traffic on Hong Kong Island and Kowloon was still chock-a-block despite the number of protesters occupying major roads thinning out. These included Harcourt Road in Admiralty and Nathan Road in Mongkok. According to the government, traffic jams started forming as early as 7 a.m. The most severe was a 5.9-kilometer tailback stretching from Aberdeen through Aberdeen Tunnel to Queen's Road East. The road between Eastern Harbour Crossing and Lung Wah Road in Admiralty had vehicles inching bumper to bumper over a 5.3-kilometer stretch. As a result, the rush hour was also extended. Usually roads are back to normal by 10 a.m., but the police said there were still severe traffic jams on Lung Wah Road at noon. The government was asked why it wasn't removing protesters to ease the acute road congestion.
Right now we are trying every means to ensure that the impact of the Occupy Central event would be minimized for Hong Kong. And as you know, and we all know, there are different groups of protesters and different areas, and actually the number fluctuates a lot. And the actual conflict on site also varies at different moments. So it would be hard for us to foresee which roads could be cleared, and also the overall plan to clear exactly which road.
Yesterday, emergency services received 1,807 calls, of which the response time to 127 was delayed due to occupied roads. Winna Wong, ATV News.